The ride that changed everything. The rain had just started to fall as the yellow taxi pulled up outside a quiet bookstore on the corner of a narrow Los Angeles street. It wasn't the kind of night people would remember. Gray clouds, cold air, and a slow drizzle that turned the city's lights into blurry reflections on wet pavement. The taxi's windshield wipers squeaked softly, clearing the driver's view every few seconds as he stared ahead, exhausted. His name was Marco. He was in his late 50s with tired eyes and hands that had seen too many long shifts. Being a taxi driver wasn't what he had dreamed of doing. But after losing his job at the factory 2 years ago and with his wife's medical bills piling up, he had no other choice. He drove 12 to 14 hours a day just to keep the lights on. Every fare mattered. Every tip counted. And on that rainy evening, he was running behind. He looked down at his watch and sighed. Another late night, another few dollars. The door opened slowly and a man stepped into the back seat. He wore a dark hoodie with the hood up, his face hidden in the shadows. Marco caught a glimpse in the rearview mirror and frowned. There was something familiar about the man's calm voice when he said, "Hi, I need to get to the Rose Hill Hospice, please." Marco nodded, putting the car into drive. "Sure thing," he replied. As they started driving, silence filled the car. Marco wasn't in the mood for small talk. He was thinking about the overdue electric bill, his wife's next hospital visit, and his daughter's school fees. He kept glancing in the mirror, wondering where he had seen the passenger before. The man remained quiet, occasionally looking out the window as the rain streaked down the glass. Something about him felt peaceful, almost like he was used to being invisible. Halfway through the ride, Marco finally broke the silence. "Visiting someone at the hospice?" he asked, his tone casual but tired. The man hesitated. "Yeah, an old friend," he said softly. "That's nice of you," Marco replied, though his voice lacked warmth. "Not many people visit there." The man didn't respond. The rest of the ride continued in silence. The taxi reached the hospice, a small, quiet building nestled among trees and old street lamps. The rain had stopped by then, leaving the air still and cold. Marco parked, turned to face the man and said, "That'll be $23. The man reached into his pocket, pulled out a few bills, and handed them to Marco. It was exactly $23. Marco stared at the cash for a moment, then looked up surprised. No tip, nothing extra, just the fare. His tiredness turned to frustration. "Really?" Marco snapped, unable to hold back. "You couldn't even leave $1?" The man paused with his hand on the door. He turned and looked directly at Marco. For the first time, Marco saw his face clearly. It was Keanu Reeves. Marco froze. He had seen him in movies. Everyone knew him. Hollywood actor, millionaire, one of the kindest people in show business, or so people said. But here he was, giving no tip to a struggling taxi driver who had just driven across the city in the rain. Keanu didn't react with anger. Instead, his voice was calm. "I understand," he said quietly. "But please, don't judge too quickly." Marco laughed bitterly. "You're kidding, right? You're Keanu Reeves. You probably spend more on a cup of coffee than I make in an hour. And you can't leave a single dollar?" Keanu nodded slowly as if he expected this. "Sometimes what people need most isn't money." "Easy for you to say," Marco muttered. "I'm trying to keep my family alive here." Keanu looked at Marco with something deeper than sympathy. There was no judgment in his eyes, no pride, only a quiet understanding. He stepped out of the car and gently closed the door behind him. Marco watched him walk toward the hospice, confused and angry. His emotions wrestled with the image of a man who was supposed to be generous now walking away without saying another word. He sat there for a long time, staring at the entrance. Part of him wanted to drive away, but something strange tugged at his heart. He reached for his phone to check the next fare, but his hands didn't move. He looked back at the building. Curiosity pulled stronger than his frustration. After a moment, Marco turned off the engine, grabbed his jacket, and stepped out into the damp night. He followed Keanu at a distance, slipping into the building quietly. The hospice smelled of flowers and antiseptic. The lights were soft and the air was filled with whispers and slow footsteps. He saw Keanu down the hallway, kneeling beside an elderly woman's bed. She was frail, her skin pale and thin. Her hand rested in his. She smiled weakly. "You came," she whispered. Keanu leaned in and kissed her forehead. "I promised." Marco stood frozen. He couldn't hear everything, but he saw everything. Tears filled the woman's eyes. Her voice cracked as she said, "I didn't think anyone would remember me." Keanu held her hand tighter. "You raised me when I had no one. You gave me a place to sleep when the world turned its back. You're the reason I'm still here." Marco turned away, stunned. The man he had just judged for not tipping had come to comfort the woman who once saved his life. Not with cameras, not for fame. Just quietly, when no one else was looking. He didn't need to tip because he was already giving something far greater. His time, his heart, his gratitude. Marco felt shame rising in his chest. And suddenly, the money didn't matter. What mattered was that he had misjudged a man he didn't really know. What mattered was that kindness often looked different than he expected. He walked back to his taxi, the sound of the rain beginning again, and sat in silence. He didn't turn on the meter. He didn't look for another fare. He just sat there listening to the quiet lesson life had just whispered. Sometimes the richest people give in ways the world can't measure, and sometimes those who seem to have it all are the ones who carry the deepest scars, and Marco had just met one of them. Behind the silence, the next morning Marco sat at his small kitchen table with a cup of lukewarm coffee. His wife, Elena, was still sleeping upstairs, worn out from her dialysis session. The day before, the rain from the night before had left the city feeling fresh, but Marco's thoughts were still tangled in what he had seen at the hospice. He couldn't shake the image of Keanu Reeves kneeling beside that woman's bed. The quiet way he had held her hand, the tears in her eyes. It wasn't the scene Marco expected from a Hollywood star. It felt too real, too raw. He stared at the $23 still in his jacket pocket. Untouched, he didn't want to spend it. Later that day, while waiting at a red light between fares, Marco opened his phone and started searching. Keanu Reeves Hospice. Visits, he typed. The results surprised him. There were a few scattered articles, most buried deep in old forums or local news. Nothing flashy, no viral headlines, just quiet mentions of him visiting old caretakers, former teachers, people who had helped him when he was young and unknown. One article stood out. It was a 10-year-old piece written by a local nurse. She spoke about a young man who used to sleep on a friend's couch because he couldn't afford rent. The friend's mother treated him like her own son. Years later, that man returned, not just with money, but with deep love and gratitude. The man was Keanu Reeves. Marco leaned back in his seat, stunned. That frail woman he saw last night. She had once been the only family Keanu had, and Marco had almost driven off without understanding a thing. Later that evening, Marco picked up another passenger. A young man in his 20s, wearing a sharp suit and carrying a bouquet of flowers. As they drove, the man asked Marco if he was okay. "You look like you've seen a ghost," he joked. Marco laughed quietly. "Just thinking about someone I met last night." The man leaned forward, curious. "Who?" Marco hesitated, then said, "Keanu Reeves." The passenger's eyes lit up. "No way. Did you really?" "Yeah. Gave him a ride to a hospice, thought he was just being cheap at first. But turns out I was the one who didn't understand." The man nodded thoughtfully. "He's one of the good ones. My cousin worked at a coffee shop a few years ago. Keanu walked in, ordered a small drink, and left a $100 tip. No cameras, no show. Just did it." Marco smiled slightly. "He didn't tip me." The man raised an eyebrow. "Really?" "No. But now I know why. It wasn't about the money." That night, Marco returned to the hospice. He wasn't sure why. Part of him wanted to apologize. Part of him just wanted to understand more. He asked the nurse at the front desk if the woman from room 7 was still awake. The nurse smiled warmly. "She passed away this morning. Peacefully. Her family wasn't around, but one visitor came and stayed with her till the end. Marco's throat tightened. Was it Keanu? He asked. The nurse nodded. He sat with her all night, sang to her, held her hand, said she was the reason he never gave up when he was young. Marco felt something shift inside his chest. A weight, maybe, or maybe it was shame, mixed with deep respect. He stood there silently, staring at the hallway he had walked through just the night before. Did she have any family? Marco asked softly. The nurse shook her head. No, just him. Did she leave anything behind? The nurse hesitated. Only a small box. We haven't gone through it yet. Marco asked if he could see it. With gentle hands, the nurse brought out a small wooden box. Inside were faded photographs, an old letter, and a tiny bracelet made of string and beads. Marco picked up the letter. The handwriting was shaky but beautiful. My dear boy, you were the light in my darkest days. I never thought the world would know your name, but I always knew your heart was gold. Thank you for never forgetting me. Thank you for showing the world that kindness doesn't need to be loud to be powerful. Marco swallowed hard. Tears blurred the words. He looked up at the nurse and asked, Can you tell him, thank you, from me? The nurse smiled. I think he already knows. On his way back to his cab, Marco passed a mother and her child waiting under a flickering street lamp. The woman looked cold, clutching her daughter close. Marco rolled down his window. Need a ride? We don't have money. The woman said. Get in, Marco replied. It's on me. As they got in, Marco felt something shift. He had driven thousands of people before, but something about this moment felt different. He wasn't just giving them a ride. He was passing on something bigger, something that started with a quiet man who tipped nothing, but gave everything. The mirror of kindness. The city buzzed with noise as the sun set, casting a warm orange glow over the streets. Traffic honked, people rushed across sidewalks, and neon signs flickered to life. But inside Marco's taxi, it was quiet. He had changed. Since the night at the hospice, he had started looking at people differently. He no longer judged by the clothes they wore, how much they tipped, or how they spoke. He started listening, really listening. The next few days he picked up passengers like he always did. But now he asked how they were. Not out of habit, but because he cared. One afternoon he picked up a young man named Josh who had just lost his job. Josh was quiet at first, but Marco asked gently, What's on your mind, kid? Josh shrugged. Life's falling apart. I was supposed to propose next month. Now I'm broke. Marco said nothing for a moment, then reached into his glove box and pulled out a small envelope. Inside was a gift card for groceries, something he had received months ago but never used. He handed it to Josh. This won't fix everything, but maybe it helps a little. Josh stared at him in disbelief. Why are you doing this? Marco smiled softly. Because someone once taught me that real giving doesn't come with a receipt. As Josh got out of the taxi, tears in his eyes, Marco felt something warm inside his chest. For the first time in years, he wasn't just surviving. He was living with purpose. But that night, something unexpected happened. Marco received a call from the taxi dispatch. A private booking had been made under his name. That was strange. Marco never did private bookings. Who booked it? He asked. They didn't leave a name, just said they wanted you. Marco hesitated, then accepted the ride. He pulled up to a small art gallery downtown. The building was quiet, its glass walls glowing softly with warm lights. Outside stood a young woman in a blue coat. She looked nervous. Marco? She asked. Yeah, that's me. She got in and gave him an address in the hills. As they started driving, Marco glanced at her in the mirror. She looked familiar. You don't remember me, do you? She asked. Marco blinked. Should I? My name's Lily. I'm the daughter of the woman you saw at the hospice. Marco's hands tightened on the wheel. I thought she didn't have family, he said gently. She didn't. Not really. I was adopted. We lost contact when I was young. But I found out she passed. And I also found out you were there. The nurse told me you stayed behind even after Keanu left. Marco nodded slowly. I didn't plan to, I just couldn't leave. Lily smiled through watery eyes. Thank you. For being there. They sat in silence for a moment as the city, lights sparkled outside the window. Then she said, Keanu told me about you. Marco looked surprised. He did? Yes. He said you reminded him of someone he used to know, someone who carried the world quietly on their shoulders. Marco swallowed hard. I didn't do anything special. You saw her. That's more than most people ever did. When they reached her stop, Lily handed Marco an envelope. This is from him, she said. Before he could speak, she stepped out and walked away into the night. Marco sat still for a long time. Finally, he opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten note. Dear Marco, you gave me a ride, but you gave me something more than that. You gave me honesty, raw and unfiltered. You showed me what the world looks like through eyes that fight daily battles. You reminded me of myself years ago. I didn't tip you because I thought you needed more than money. I wanted you to see something bigger. I hoped you would follow that moment into something deeper. And you did. Thank you for not just driving me, but for walking with me, even if you didn't know it. Keep going. People like you are the reason the world still has hope. Keanu. Neath the note was a check. Marco's hands shook as he looked at the number. $50,000. He stared at it for a long time, unsure whether to laugh or cry. But he didn't cash it. Not yet. Instead, he drove home quietly, the city's sounds fading into the background. When he got home, he found Elena sitting by the window sipping tea. She looked up at him and smiled. Long day? He walked over, kissed her forehead and said, Yeah, but a good one. He didn't tell her about the money yet. Instead, he sat beside her and said, I think we need to talk about something. What is it? I want to do more than just drive taxis. Elena looked curious. What do you mean? Marco looked out the window, the lights of Los Angeles stretching far into the distance. I want to help people, not just with rides, but with their stories, their struggles. Elena took his hand. Then do it. She said softly, I believe in you. And that was all he needed to hear. That night, Marco didn't sleep. He stayed up writing ideas on napkins, sketching plans, in an old notebook, dreaming again for the first time in years. And at the top of the page, he wrote one word: kindness. The ripple effect. A week had passed since Marco received the letter and check from Keanu. He still hadn't cashed it. The envelope sat on his kitchen table like a quiet reminder that his life had changed, not because of money, but because of a moment. Marco didn't want to use the money for himself, not yet. Instead, he used something else that had been reignited inside him: hope. He started small. The first thing he did was print a simple flyer and tape it inside his taxi window. It read, free rides for anyone who's struggling. Just ask. No questions, no judgment. At first, people just stared. Some passengers ignored it. Others smiled politely but said nothing. Then one rainy afternoon, a woman climbed into the back seat holding a crying baby. She looked exhausted, soaked from head to toe. I saw your sign, she whispered. I just need to get to the clinic. My daughter's sick. Marco didn't hesitate. You don't have to explain, we'll get you there. The ride was quiet except for the baby's soft sobs. When they arrived at the clinic, the woman tried to give him a crumpled $5 bill. Marco shook his head. Keep it, buy her something warm. Her eyes filled with tears. Thank you, she whispered, holding his hand. Nobody ever helps people like us. Marco simply smiled and said, somebody once helped me. This is me passing it on. That moment became the seed. The next day, He started a small project with his daughter Mia, who had recently come back home to help take care of Elena. Together, they launched a social page called Rides of Hope. Marco posted short stories of people he met without names or photos, just words. Raw, honest moments that unfolded inside his taxi. He didn't do it for likes or attention. He just wanted people to feel seen. Stories like the teenage boy who cried quietly after telling Marco he was kicked out of his house. Or the elderly man who wrote in silence until Marco asked how long he'd been alone. He said, 13 years. And then said nothing more. Each post ended with a line. You never know who's in your back seat. Be kind. The stories started spreading. Not overnight, but steadily. People shared them, commented, messaged. Soon, Marco was receiving letters from strangers offering to donate for free rides. Some sent care packages for struggling families. One woman sent 3 boxes of children's jackets and shoes, asking if Marco could give them to families in need. Marco was overwhelmed, but deeply moved. And then one evening, as he parked his taxi near the grocery store, a familiar figure appeared. It was Keanu. Not dressed like a movie star, just in a plain hoodie and jeans. Marco stepped out of the taxi, unsure of what to say. Keanu smiled. I've been reading your stories. Marco laughed nervously. You follow my page? I follow kindness, Keanu replied. They stood there, quietly, 2 men from different worlds bound by something invisible. I didn't cash the check, Marco said after a moment. I figured, Keanu replied. It didn't feel right. Then use it for what does. Marco nodded slowly. I want to start something real, like a small network. Free rides for people in need. Not just here, maybe other drivers too. I just don't know how yet. Keanu reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded piece of paper. This might help, he said. Marco unfolded it. It was a contact, a woman who ran a nonprofit focused on transportation access for low-income families. She's waiting for your call, Keanu said with a small smile. Marco's hands trembled as he held the paper. Why me? He asked softly. Because you didn't need a tip to become generous, Keanu said. You just needed a reminder of who you already were. They shook hands. Then Keanu said, This isn't just your story anymore. It's theirs. All of them. Every person who sat in your back seat. That night, Marco sat with Elena and Mia, explaining everything. He told them about the network idea, how drivers could volunteer time or routes for those who couldn't afford transportation, especially elderly, single mothers, or people with medical needs. Elena squeezed his hand. You found your purpose, Mia smiled through tears. And you didn't even need a cape. The next few weeks became a blur of planning, calls, emails, and meetings. Marco didn't know how to start a charity, but he knew how to care. And that was enough. He named it the Backseat Project. The mission was simple. No one should be left behind because they can't afford a ride. He reached out to other taxi drivers, rideshare drivers, even bus operators. Many said yes, some said no. But the ones who joined did so with their hearts open. Marco used Keanu's check as seed money, buying fuel cards, printing flyers, and creating a small app with Mia's help. People started noticing. One day, Marco received a call from a radio station asking for an interview. He hesitated. He wasn't good with microphones, but Elena encouraged him. Just speak from the same place you drive from, your heart. The interview aired. People listened. A woman from New York called and said, I want to start a chapter here. A man from Texas messaged, Can I do this with my delivery van? And just like that, the Backseat Project began to grow beyond Los Angeles. Marco didn't expect it. He never saw himself as a leader. But now others were looking to him for guidance. One night, as he sat alone in his taxi, he looked up at the stars and whispered, Thank you, Keanu, not just for the ride, not for the check, but for the moment when one man decided to teach another that worth isn't measured in dollars. It's measured in how we make others feel seen. When kindness goes viral, the sun had barely risen when Marco's phone buzzed nonstop on the nightstand. He groaned, still half asleep, and reached for it. Hundreds of notifications lit up the screen. Texts from friends, missed calls from unknown numbers, emails from reporters. His daughter Mia rushed into the room, waving her phone in the air. "Dad, you're on the news! The national news!" Marco sat up, rubbing his eyes. "What are you talking about?" She opened a video. The headline read, "From a simple taxi ride to a national kindness movement. Meet the man behind the back seat project." It was a 3-minute segment. It showed a smiling Marco helping an elderly woman into his taxi. It showed short clips from his Rides of Hope posts. And finally, it ended with a soft voiceover. This man didn't build his movement with fame or fortune. He built it with a moment. A single act that changed how he saw the world, and how the world now sees him. Marco stared in silence. Elena placed a hand on his shoulder. "It's happening, isn't it?" He nodded slowly. "Yeah, I think it is." Within hours, more drivers signed up. Offers came in, fuel donations, free vehicle maintenance, even a small grant from a community fund to support the project's expansion. Marco was overwhelmed, but deeply grateful. And then came a call he never expected. "Hi, this is Claire from The Ellen Show. Ellen would love to invite you on for an interview." Marco nearly dropped his phone. He didn't say yes right away. He needed to think. He wasn't doing this for attention. But Mia reminded him, "Dad, this is a chance to tell more people, to inspire more kindness." So he agreed. Days later, Marco stood backstage, heart pounding, waiting for the curtain to rise. Ellen greeted him with her signature smile, and the crowd clapped as he walked out. He wore his usual clothes. Nothing fancy, just who he was. Ellen introduced him. He's the taxi driver who thought a Hollywood star was cheap, then discovered a story that would change his life and the lives of thousands. The audience laughed and clapped. Marco sat down and told his story. About the rainy night, about the no-tip ride, about Keanu Reeves and how that small moment opened his eyes. Ellen leaned forward. "And now you've helped over 4,000 people with free or donated rides. That's incredible." Marco smiled. "I didn't do it alone. People want to help. They just don't always know how." Then Ellen said, "We heard about your wife's medical condition. We'd like to cover her treatment costs for the next year." Marco's eyes widened. The crowd erupted in applause. But Ellen wasn't finished. "And there's one more surprise." The lights dimmed. A screen lowered behind them. A video began playing. Clips of people across the country saying thank you. A nurse in Texas, a mother in Ohio, a teenage boy in Florida. Each one saying how the Backseat Project helped them, and then the final clip appeared. Keanu Reeves, his voice calm and warm. "Marco, thank you for taking something small and making it into something life-changing. Your story reminds all of us that the real heroes don't wear capes. They drive taxis, give second chances, and show up when it matters most." Marco wiped his eyes, overwhelmed. The interview ended with a standing ovation, and just like that, the world knew his story. But when Marco got home, the real work continued. The project had grown so large that he needed help managing it. He partnered with Mia to build a small team of volunteers, retired drivers, students, even tech folks willing to improve their app. They started mapping out areas with the most need, places where public transportation was limited, and people had no other way to reach hospitals, grocery stores, or school. And then, one night, something unexpected happened. A black car pulled up outside Marco's house. Keanu stepped out holding a small box. "Thought you might want to see this," he said. Inside the box was the same beaded bracelet Marco had seen in the hospice. "She wanted me to give this to someone," Keanu said. "Someone who reminds me of her." He handed it to Marco. Marco's hands trembled as he held it. "I don't know what to say." "Just keep doing what you're doing," Keanu said. "That's enough." They sat on the porch in silence, watching. The city lights flicker in the distance. After a while, Marco asked, Do you think people really change? Keanu smiled. I think people remember who they are when someone believes in them. Marco nodded slowly. And in that moment, they were just two men. No cameras, no headlines. United by something far greater than fame or money. They were united by a quiet belief that kindness, real, ordinary kindness, can ripple through the world and reach far beyond what we can ever see. The gift that never ends. 6 months had passed since Marco first gave Keanu Reeves a ride in the rain. The city had changed. Or maybe Marco had. Everywhere he went, people recognized him. Not because he was famous, but because he had become a symbol of what it meant to choose kindness over anger, service over self, love over judgment. But fame wasn't what moved Marco. What moved him was the small things, like the handwritten letters he received from strangers. One was from an elderly woman in Michigan who said she hadn't left her home in 3 years until a driver in the backseat project took her to the park just to feel the wind again. Another was from a teenage girl in Arizona who said she got to her scholarship interview because of a free ride. She got accepted. Her letter ended with, "You didn't just drive me to school, you drove me to a better future." Those letters sat in a wooden box beside his bed. More precious than gold. His wife Elena was doing better. Her treatments had improved with the help of the coverage arranged by Ellen's team. She smiled more now, laughed at the kitchen table again. And Mia, his daughter, was thriving. She had quit her job at the grocery store and now worked full-time managing the backseat project. She organized drivers, handled social media, even set up partnerships with hospitals and shelters. They had created something real. But Marco knew they had more to do. One night, Marco sat alone in his taxi again. It was raining, just like that. First night. He drove slowly through quiet streets, watching reflections dance on the glass. And then he saw him. An old man sitting alone on a bench, soaked from the rain, holding a plastic bag filled with all his belongings. Marco pulled over. He rolled down the window. "Sir, do you need a ride?" The man looked up, eyes weary. "I got no money." "I didn't ask for money," Marco said gently. The man hesitated, then nodded and got in. As they drove, Marco offered him a bottle of water and a sandwich from his glove box. The man took them with shaking hands. "Thank you," he whispered. "People usually just drive past." Marco smiled. "I almost did. Once. But someone stopped for me. And it changed everything." The ride was quiet after that. When they reached the shelter, the man turned to him. "What's your name?" Marco looked at him and said, "I'm just a driver." "But the name's Marco." The man smiled, the kind of smile that said he hadn't smiled in a long time. "Well, Marco, I won't forget this." As the man stepped out and walked toward the shelter, Marco sat there watching the raindrops slide down his window. He thought about how one small moment, a ride with no tip, had turned into thousands of rides filled with hope. He thought about how easy it is to misjudge someone, and how healing it is when we take the time to understand them instead. The next morning, Marco received an unexpected package. Inside was a photo in a simple wooden frame. It was from Keanu. The photo showed Marco helping the mother with the crying baby, the one he gave a free ride 2 weeks ago. On the back of the photo was a message. "This isn't about what you did for me. It's about what you do for everyone. Never underestimate the power of small things." Keanu Marco hung the photo on the wall of their small home office, right above a corkboard filled with maps, names, and notes from drivers all across the country. The backseat project had grown to 30 cities now. More than 600 drivers had joined, and not a single one of them asked for payment. They asked for purpose. Marco stood in front of the corkboard, heart full, eyes soft, and whispered, "Thank you, not just to Keanu, not just to the people he helped, but to life itself, for giving him a second chance to matter." And then, Marco did something he hadn't done in a long time. He opened his journal and began to write again. At the top of the page, he scribbled, Ride 1. The man who gave nothing, but everything. Because sometimes the story that changes the world doesn't begin with a hero. It begins with a misunderstanding, a wrong assumption, a lesson learned, and a ride that never really ended.